please join me in welcoming the distinguished Chris Inglis.
Thanks, Pat. Thank you. Thank you. If we could start the slides. Can you all hear me in the back? Excellent. It's a delight to be here. Having flown into Indianapolis last night and driven across, I know why I've not been here yet. But you know, I'm just delighted to be here. Purdue's reputation at the National Security Agency and various places where I've gone precedes itself. I happen to graduate from the U.S. Air Force Academy, which has, I think, the third highest population representative within the astronaut corps. I teach at the Naval Academy, which is number 2 on the list, and here I am at Purdue, which is number 1, for a good reason. Kind of SPAF's introduction notwithstanding, I once had to explain to my 8-year-old at the time what the Deputy Director of the National Security Agency does, and I did so in my best unclassified voice. And when I was all done, he said, "So you don't do anything," right? Which is probably about right in terms of meeting strategy, testifying before Congress, kind of, you know, you're the magnet so that they don't bother the people who do the real work. Today I'm going to talk about security in the age of cyber as opposed to cybersecurity, because I think cybersecurity is sometimes, well, I do think it is a misnomer. We focus on it for its own sake as opposed to the larger purpose. We have a major at the United States Naval Academy. It's now the second most popular major on the campus out of 25 different majors. So about 13-14% of the class signs up for that major, and not at the expense of computer science, in no small part attributable to the mentoring and guidance of SPAF, who's part of our cyber oversight board. But in that major, we essentially teach kids, 17 to 21-year-olds, professional, kind of aspiring military officers, we teach them how to make strategic choices in a world dependent upon digital infrastructure. And that's certainly got a technology underpinning, but more importantly, it's got a strategy underpinning, it's got an operational theory underpinning, it's got an ethical underpinning, it's got a legal underpinning. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about perhaps how to think about that at the 30,000-foot level. Not the technical details and not the kind of waving your hands over a little map, but rather to say if the United States and like-minded nations needs a strategy for how to think about this space, I offer my own experience in this regard. I'm a member of the Defense Science Board. I'm on the FedEx Board of Directors. We've had some interesting experiences in cyberspace. We think we're in a cyber skirmish every day of the year. I'm currently on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and so I'm charged to think about this. I'm not sure my thinking is fully mature, but I'll offer what I have in that regard. If I might start with a joke, is that permissible here? All right, so excellent. So you know, working at the National Security Agency, you know how you can tell an extrovert from an introvert, right? You've heard the story, right? An extrovert looks at your shoes in the conversation, right? So look at me, I'm going to tell the joke. So I was an Air Force pilot for 26 years, meaning that's true. That's not the joke, meaning I was happy once. And for 21 of those years, I flew a single airplane type, a C-130. C-130 is a big lumbering beast, doesn't actually fly, makes enough noise to scare the ground away. But I flew a B model, which tells you something about the variant of the technology on board. I flew an E model, which was a little bit more kind of current, and then I flew a J model, which was very current, right? Fly-by-wire, and remove the navigator, remove the engineer, install them in a box. The B model, the first one that I flew, had technology that dated back to 1650. It had a sextant on board. If you want to know where you were in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, you essentially shot the moon, the sun, the stars. You got a triangle, 3 lines of bearing that was about that big, for those of you in the back. Turns out the Pacific is about this big, so it's good enough, but it's not helpful because that triangle is the size of Texas. But that's not the joke. The joke runs a little bit like this. C-130 has 4 engines. Those of you who are pilots in the room, show of hands. Those of you who are passengers in the room, show of hands. You're all familiar with the story I'm about to tell. 4-engine airplane takes off. The most dangerous phase of flight, of course, is the takeoff leg, right? Because if something goes wrong there, you might not have the rudder authority to do the thing that you should. You might not have enough power to take off. You might have too little runway to essentially stop. And so it's a kind of an interesting moment. So you motor through the takeoff, you make enough noise, you scare the ground away, huge sigh of relief up front, you're now kind of lumbering up to altitude. And in this 4-engine beast, you get to about 19,000 feet in the day. That was actually about as good as we can do, fully loaded up. And you're heading outbound. You're heading away from the United States to some interesting place. Turns out C-130 can only get you halfway there, so you're probably heading to an island somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But all the same, you get about 3-4 hours off the eastern seaboard, heading for maybe lodges in the Azores, and you pass the equal time point. Huge sigh of relief up front because you don't have to go back to the United States. It's a good time to be away from Washington, but that's another story. And as you're cruising along, along, you kind of hear this sputter, and you kind of look out the window, and you see this kind of puff of smoke and a little bit of flame, and you realize you're about to lose the number one engine, one of your 4 engines. Actually, up front, it's a moment of huge relief. It's joy, because this boring kind of sojourn is now about to be populated with something interesting, a bar story, if you will. Right? So you essentially go through the routines of shutting that engine down. There's a kind of a script that you have to follow to show that you've got the right stuff. And then just like in a car, if you want to essentially extend your distance, you lower the speed, and you would, in this case, lower your altitude. So you're going to be a little bit lower, a little bit slower, so that you can essentially increase your range. And you announce that with some amount of pride to the passengers and crew. We've lost an engine, don't worry, we've got 4, we can do this on 3. We'll be a little bit lower, a little bit slower, but we'll make it just fine. Now I'm going to fast forward the story a bit. They lose a second engine, still a moment of great joy up front, because this is really going to be a very interesting bar story. So they kind of secure the engine, they announce to the passengers and crew, we'll be a little bit lower, a little bit slower, but we can make it on 2 engines, we're already at altitude. They lose a third engine, not realizing there's a trend developing here. And I'm going to lift and shift this to cyberspace in just a moment, but they lose a third engine, and they kind of, the octave of their voice is up just a little bit, still pretty exciting. If we survive this, this will be the most amazing bar story. So they shut that engine down, they're motoring, limping along on 1 engine. They announce to the passengers and crew, well, thank goodness we've got 4 engines, because already at altitude, we can limp along at 1. We'll be a little bit lower, a little bit slower, but I think we just might be able to make it. At which point a passenger in the back goes, well, I hope we don't lose the last engine, because if we do, we'll be up here all day. Now, why do I tell that story? First, I like the story. Second, I think that there's actually a very strong analogy in what's happening in cyberspace. Right? We've experienced pratfall after pratfall, cut after cut, death by 1,000 cuts, and we think we're okay because we've got another one, we've got another 10. We can limp along. We're already at altitude. We're cruising. We've got this forward momentum, not realizing there just might be a step function out there. This could be existential, if not to the critical functions that we rely on cyberspace for, maybe to our expectations. And perhaps our expectations will diminish, our aspirations will diminish, and we'll make far less use of cyberspace, this great good, this unalloyed good that can solve cancer in our lifetime, that can solve the weather problems in our lifetime, can do all of the magic and wonder that we all know it to be. Right? And so I'm going to talk a little bit today about how I think about that, what then might be a strategy to put the various pieces together. And it won't be any surprise to you that the pieces I think are at least at the kind of the 50,000 foot level: technology, people, right, the human component, and procedure, policy, doctrine, that sort of thing. So let's begin. I think I point this thing at the SPAF bobblehead. Oh, okay, good. Oh, the lower set of button. Great. Okay, good. I don't think anybody in the room needs to kind of read these words, but essentially it says, if you look to the folks that are responsible for critical functions, the top box talks about what the Securities Exchange Commission says about publicly traded companies, but any company reliant upon digital infrastructure. It says, be very afraid. And if you look at the bottom box, it says that the Director of National Intelligence, as recently as 2 months ago, said that this issue is with us for years to come. The risk that we suffer in cyberspace is with us for years to come. This is not a job generator. This is not a sales pitch for technology. This is the reality that this domain, this place called cyberspace, is not safe, and it's not likely to be safe for the kind of foreseeable future. And I would say that that's a reality as opposed to a dirge, right? So therefore, there's something we can do to defend ourselves in this domain. And I'll talk a little bit about that. There's a wonderful website out there. It's called informationisbeautiful.com. You don't need to read the details of this. Just note that every bubble on this chart, which essentially shows breaches from present day back to the dawn of time, every bubble in this chart represents a breach of some sort. If it's a large bubble, it's a large breach. If it's a small bubble, it's a small breach. But there's not much white space up here. And frankly, one of my early insights in this is that if you were to manipulate this as you can on that website and say, just show me the breaches attributable to humans, right? Take all the ones off that are solely attributable to technology. It's the same chart, right? Tiny little bubble in the upper right-hand corner goes away. So people are, very, very much implicated in this plot. This is a confidentiality, sometimes an availability issue. There's another chart. This is a kind of depiction of the world's landform. For the record, I'm not a flat earther, despite the fact that this looks like I've kind of depicted the Earth as flat. It's just an interesting physical artifact. But laid over top of this is a denial of service attack, essentially somebody hurling Nerf balls at your front door so that you can't get to the front door, illegitimate request for service. A denial of service attack in 2012, 2013 that occurred on 200 separate days. So prosecuted by the Iranian nation state. Why? Because they were probably angry at the United States and perhaps trying to take a whack at something that it found to be a piece of critical infrastructure. If you're a red dot, you're essentially hurling these Nerf balls. You're hurling the denial of service attack. If you're a blue dot, you're receiving them. So you can see a heavy concentration on the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States, but it's globally interconnected. You can see Sydney's playing a role, London's playing a role. They're all part of the victim set. If you're a yellow dot, you're part of the global infrastructure that on a moment's notice could be turned right to the attack and used to become a red dot so that you can hurl these Nerf balls. What I find interesting about this is a couple of things. One, nation state did this with impunity. No consequences whatsoever ensued to Iran, despite the fact that this went on from August to June of 2012, 2013. Two, it required very little technical sophistication. And three, and most interesting of all, if you look at this chart, it's very hard to see Tehran. Right? You can't see that the source of this is in fact Tehran. There's no physical geography that gives you a sense based upon this very accurate virtual depiction, no physical geography that comports or essentially tracks with this to say, oh, I can see where it's coming from. It's very hard to do that. Cyber has some unique characteristics, such if you're trying to figure out who's who in the zoo, your experience in the physical world doesn't do you much good. Next chart, kind of not to be outdone, we had a series of attacks on commercial infrastructure that I don't think were the purpose of those attacks, but I'll explain in a minute. In 2017, and then kind of going into 2018, I'll explain that in a little bit, which I would describe as brazen, indiscriminate, and hugely impactful. These were, of course, in the spring of 2017 and the summer of 2017, something called WannaCry in the spring and then NotPetya in the summer. WannaCry was an attack we now know by the North Korean nation state, probably in its role as a criminal enterprise, but the North Korean nation state, an attack called ransomware, which essentially, if you were unprotected, if you had failed to patch a particular variant of the Microsoft operating system, then they would go in and kind of use this zero-day vulnerability and encrypt your data such that you would then have to pay them 300 bitcoins to decrypt the data. If it was data that was critical to you, say you're the National Health System, not making that up, UK's National Health System went down hard because they hadn't actually kept their inventory, their state up to speed. And if you kind of needed your data back about patient appointments, about prescription regimes, about who's scheduled for surgery today, the premise was that you'd read the note on your screen, you'd send 300 bitcoins off to some account, and whoever it was behind that screen would then send you the key. Turns out the North Koreans were incompetent. They were unable, right, to send you the key. So whatever bitcoins got kind of sent into the ether, nothing ever came back. That was brazen, crossed anybody's definition of a red line. It was indiscriminate. The UK's National Health System was not the target, right? The target was perhaps others who might perhaps simply be commercial providers, maybe governments, but you were in the splash zone simply by being on the network, and it was impactful, especially if you were in the UK's National Health System. In the summer of 2017, the Russians, in their attempt to impose yet another consequence on the Ukrainian nation state, executed an attack called NotPetya, again using a zero-day vulnerability and kind of instrumenting that in a particularly clever way. Went into the Ukrainian government, out the other side to anything that was attached to the Ukrainian government. So Pfizer, Maersk Global Shipping Line, FedEx, its European operations, all of whom were operating at privilege with the Ukrainian government to exchange tax receipts on the fly, came out the other side into those kind of enterprises, caused upwards of about $1.8 billion of immediate cost, but untold reputational harm and certainly some concern on, can I actually trust digital infrastructure anymore? Russian nation state probably did that because they were after the Ukraine. It was indiscriminate because it affected a global marketplace. So I'm going to back up a little bit and then say, so if that's perhaps the kind of caution note. That's the kind of burning platform. I'm going to say, so what is it we would need to get our arms around if we're going to actually create order and discipline in this space, whatever this space is? Now, there's one definition, and I, being an Air Force officer, at least a retired Air Force officer, I could actually kind of show you what this means in 67 PowerPoint slides, but I won't do that. But I'm just going to say that cyberspace for many, especially mere mortals, not many of whom are in the room, folks that are actually just saying, I'm not a digital native, I'm an app native, I just want to use the darn thing. It's very confusing. It's a mix, it's a jumble. Pipes, wires, data feeds, servers, routers, whatever that is, people, procedure, all interleaved and kind of jumbled on top of one another. You could tease this apart, talk about its constituent pieces, but frankly, it comes down to this. Cyberspace is this meld of technology and people and procedure. Right? If you want to think about it from the adversary's perspective, if they want to take advantage of something that you've actually stored in cyberspace or some dependency you have on cyberspace, they think about taking you on in 3 dimensions. Right? They're going to think about you. Can they hack you? Can they beat you? Can they get you to do something that maybe you know you shouldn't do or something you don't know is dangerous, but they're essentially going to come after your weakness. Second, they're going to come after your procedure, your doctrine, your expectations, your assumptions, your hubris, your arrogance. That's procedure, doctrine. Third, they're going to come after you using technology or sometimes using a technology flaw. But most of the events that I look at, right, you can essentially fairly say it was the first 2 things that they took advantage of. If that's how an adversary thinks of this space, and an adversary, frankly, has a more integrated view of this space than any defender I've met, if that's how an adversary thinks of the space, then that might be a fair definition at the 100,000-foot level of the space. But that's insufficient because you have to then think about what the context is. I've just put this big red blob around that, and if you can't read the bottom, that cyberspace that I talked about, is really difficult, really challenging, not because of its own characteristics, but because it exists permanently in the presence of adversaries. Permanently in the presence of adversaries. There's now a criterion out for academic institutions, 4-year or 2-year academic institutions, to graduate kids, students, in the field of cyber science. And up front, they have defined what they mean by cyber science as being the meld of people, procedure, and technology. They use fancier words than that, in the presence of adversaries. That's really, really important. Right? If you assume that the system is going to be installed in a benevolent, benign environment, and it therefore only needs to contend with human error perhaps in the design, error in its implementation, but not have to deal with squirrels who might break into your electrical enclosure, or Russians, same thing, who perhaps try to attack you through the Ukraine. I'm sorry, I digressed in that regard. Then you're going to perhaps fall short in your expectations about what you really need to defend against. The strategic context, continuing. We used to say that the sins and sinners in this space, again, thinking about this from the adversary's perspective, because they have the most holistic view, we used to say that the sins in this space were typically of, hey, I don't want somebody to steal my data, so I worry about confidentiality. I don't want somebody to disrupt my system such that it is no longer available to me. And I certainly don't want anybody to destroy the stuff that now is uniquely stored in the space. My bank accounts, small as they may be, are entirely represented by 1s and 0s in this space. And so I don't want somebody to wipe those clean. We used to say that the sinners in this space were criminals. Of course, they're trying to get access to this material for their own benefit. Nation states for various purposes. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Hacktivists, nothing better to do. They've not yet encountered their curfew, so they're still up and doing some interesting things. And insiders who perhaps have a score to settle. What's interesting to me is in the last 2 years, you have to add another sin. Subversion, down at the bottom. And this is different in kind, right, than the traditional worries about confidentiality, integrity, availability. Subversion is a hack of the human being to a much greater degree than a hack of the 3 parts that, I would say comprise cyberspace. Subversion is something, and I'll explain in the next slide, we as a nation and other nations, but the United States experienced richly in the year 2016. And so what does that look like? Now this busy slide I'm going to explain from the bottom up. And essentially what I say is that if you want to think about what the Russians did to the United States in terms of its election system, from about 2014 to 2016, despite the fact that this chart says it continued to 2018, it did. But if you look back to that prior period, the Russians essentially came at us at 3 levels. Right? First and foremost, the Russians used their ability to hack networks, people, procedure, the Democratic National Committee, for one. They use their ability to do that to steal emails, to perhaps garner some information. They use their ability to perhaps manipulate that infrastructure to run troll farms and to release sometimes accurate, sometimes inaccurate information, but in a tailored, segmented way, such that what they did was to do things that we would say at the foundational level are kind of easily described as violations of confidentiality, integrity, availability. And if you wanted to defend yourself against that at that foundational level, you would say basic information assurance, right? We need resilience, we need robustness, perhaps resilience not just in the architecture, the technical architecture, but resilience in the people, right? Somebody should know not to click on a link that you might not know is from Russia, but you probably know doesn't have the right provenance. And so if you kind of then did that, you say, let's just do basic information assurance, defend ourselves against the Russians at that foundational level, and stepped back with some degree of satisfaction and said, done, you would have missed the point. Because the Russians really weren't after the emails. They really didn't care about getting bragging rights on, their masterful allocation of people to troll farms, or the IRA, the Russian Research Institute. What they were really after was something more, right? Extrapolate those emails, extrapolate that digital infrastructure, expand what those people were doing in the election system up one level further. And what the Russians were after was the election system. And if you wanted to defend that, you need a fundamentally different approach, an augmented approach, not kind of independent of what happens at the foundational level. But if you're going to defend the U.S. election system, you actually need to form a collaboration between 50 states and 4 territories, because that's where the voter registration takes place. That's where the defense of the voter registration takes place. That's where the actual election takes place. It's hugely distributed and delegated. And so you need to stand back and say, got it. These guys aren't playing kind of tic-tac-toe, they're playing perhaps checkers. And so at the second level, you need to add something more in terms of what you do. But if you then, with some degree of satisfaction, perhaps a certain degree of smugness, step back and fold your hands and say, done, right, I've defended against these guys, you've missed it that they really weren't after that at all. They were attending at a third level, which is the top level of this chart. They were after our confidence, our psychology. They were after kind of the American sense that an election system serves their purposes. What they were after was not so much the winners, but the losers of the election, to say that the losers get up the day after and say, I'm not sure I believe the result. I'm not sure that I'm confident that this system serves the American people, and therefore there's some degree of internal dissension, contention, conflict that's generated because of the lack of confidence in this underpinning digital infrastructure. That's the level that the Russians are playing at, and in order to essentially beat that game, you need to think at all 3 levels. They're not playing tic-tac-toe, they're not playing checkers, they're playing 3-dimensional chess, or kind of in the extreme, they're playing Go. And so what do we do about that? Well, first I'm going to step back and say, so what are the conventional wisdom associated with either how the space operates or the things that we do to defend ourselves in that space? And so, busy little chart, I'll walk you through this, but thoughts on, did I skip a chart? Nope, I've got it. First, let me back up. I did skip this chart, say a little bit about this. This, I think, falls out of what I've said so far. But the overlays in terms of you stand back and say, well, what is happening in the space? Most folks would see this inexorable onrush of technology. I have an iPhone 8 because I haven't yet paid for it, right? So I'm still paying month by month. I probably have another year to go on that. I think there's an iPhone 10 out there. I don't actually read the ads because I don't want to cry, right? And so I think about this inexorable onrush of the devices and the apps and all that stuff. But frankly, that's not the pacing function in this space. The pacing function is 4 things. 1, there is a new geography, unreconciled to the old. Right? Think about how people who actually are successful in using digital infrastructure think about geography. They don't think about physical jurisdictions. Right? They think about this boundaryless world. Now, you know that to a fairly well. But unless you understand that new geography, you're going to be condemned, right, to essentially operate at the speed of the old geography. I don't think I need to say more. We have netizens alongside citizens, my clever way of saying that people increasingly have a propensity to organize not by physical proximity. Right? So somebody told me earlier they were born and raised in this kind of city, and therefore they thought there was one college in the world, and they went to Purdue. Right? Now, that's probably exactly the right answer no matter where you live on the planet Earth, but it's probably also because of some degree of physical proximity. You kind of said, that's the school, that's where I'm going to go. Right? People now have an opportunity to organize by ideology across these broad networks that can either inspire or connect or radicalize them. And in turn, they have an equal opportunity to reach out and do that across these networks without regard to physical proximity. In the physical world, we worry about that phenomenon as a kind of source of lone wolf terrorist. People who get up in San Bernardino, California one day and kill their fellow citizens, when they would look back at that person and say, but you're one of us. We've lived alongside each other. We play softball together, right? This issue of kind of something sometimes wonderful, kind of think of Tahrir Square in terms of the Arab Spring, sometimes insidious, is a prospect that we need to think our way through of how do we make sure that it is the former, it's inspiring, and not the latter, insidious. Disparity endures. That's the third phenomenon. No big surprise. There are people who have a lot of money and people who don't. People who then try to either collaborate or compete or conflict, right, to reconcile that discrepancy, increasingly use cyberspace to do that. Now that is not simply kind of restricted to money. There's sometimes a difference in religious respect. There's sometimes a difference in geopolitical respect. But cyberspace increasingly is the venue where those reconciliations take place. And then finally, geopolitics continues apace. That Russian example I gave, that's geopolitics playing out. That North Korean example I gave, geopolitics playing out. The Iranian geopolitics playing out. And while the sinners still are in quantity order, right, the criminals, the nation states, the hacktivists, and the insiders, increasingly the one that's jumping off the chart in terms of having an enormous consequence are the nation states. So now to these next two slides. This clicker is very eager to please, I must say. So conventional wisdom. Let me just walk down conventional wisdom. We used to think that the hazards in the space were the big three that I talked about: theft, disruption, destruction. We used to think that threat paced the risk. What's that mean? Meaning that you didn't defend yourself against something until you knew that something or someone was actually trying to do it to you, right? That there was some kind of presence, there was some life force that was actually after you. We used to think that cyber was an information technology issue. It's like the motor pool. Just make the darn thing work, would you? Because I have things to do. I've got an operation to conduct over here. Meanwhile, those operators are the ones taking all the risks. The poor technologists have no idea what the risks are, but I'll say more about that in a minute. We used to think there were clean lines between the criminal and the nation state. North Korea has actually blown that right out of the water, Russia too. We used to think the private sector was on the front lines and could handle it. That's still partially true. We used to think of the government as a regulator or a defender asynchronously, right? You didn't really know which version of the government was going to show up. I was actually in the White House when the Iranians were attacking. I was on the National Security Council as a kind of deputy at NSA. When the Iranians were attacking, U.S. financial infrastructure day after day after day across 2012, 2013, save you the long, interesting story about how the government came to its conclusions about what it would or wouldn't do. But there was a moment in time when the chair of a meeting, chair of the National Security Council, said, so what are your industry, what are your commercial private sector counterparts telling you? Went down one side of the table, right, the folks that typically represented the regulatory component of government, and each and every one of them said, we've talked to the private sector, they're fine, they don't need our help, thank you very much. 'Tis but a scratch. Right? Went down the other side of the table, which typically provided advice, counsel, meaningful support, right, to the private sector, had no regulatory function whatsoever, and all of them said, they're dying out there. They wonder why we're not kind of standing in, why we're not helping them, why we're not defending the private sector against a nation state. Because the first side of that was the regulators, when they showed up, right, it kind of threw a wet blanket on you. And the second side would bring fire hoses, right? And those two faces of government, which you couldn't predict which was which, made it such in the old days, right, that this was a crapshoot as to whether you would tell the government, I've got a problem. So now, I would say that kind of now in future, to those three risks, add subversion. It's a big deal. And you defend yourself against subversion in a way that's different. It's an extension of how you might defend yourself against the first three. As opposed to threat being the thing that then paces your sense of risk, increasingly it should be vulnerability. What do I mean by that? I mean, if you have some latent vulnerability, even if nobody in the world knows about it, even if nobody in the world you think would take advantage of it, you better think about defending yourself against that, because its movement from a vulnerability to a risk could occur in hours' time, right? And you're not necessarily going to be the target if you're the victim. We used to think that cyber was just an information technology issue. It's an operational issue. It's the operators who take the risk. And this is fundamentally a primary business function, not a technology function that if it doesn't work, you just do your business some other way. Criminal lines between the criminal and the state's blurring. In some cases, it's completely overlapped. The private sector is still on the front lines. It can't handle all of that. If you ask Maersk, if you ask FedEx, if you ask Pfizer, if you ask any number of other companies that have experienced some of these near existential threats, they would say, look, we believe that we've got to do everything we can to create resilience, to understand what's then happening on top of that digital infrastructure, so cognizance, real-time situational awareness, and frankly, to muster some resources necessary to respond and recover. But we can't prevail against a nation state. There are certain things we just can't bring to bear. We can't issue diplomatic demarches, we can't go to the United Nations, we can't mobilize an army if you ever wanted to do that, we can't do criminal prosecution, we can't do financial sanctions. So the private sector is increasingly saying we need a partnership. And then finally, the government needs to step in as partner, regulator, defender concurrently. And it needs to lead with its most benign, benevolent face as opposed to perhaps its kind of nasty, cost-imposing face. Thoughts on practice? We used to think that prevention was king. Let's defend the choke points, right? So now kind of the detection and perhaps suppression of malware, that's still important. But if that's your sense that I can catch this at the choke points and the core is safe, then you're about 10 years out of date, right? Detect and react used to be thought of as viable strategy. In many cases, it still is the strategy of, hey, I'm going to stand back and inside my perimeter, whatever that might be, I'll just detect, right, the incoming arrows, and I'll run around and I'll gather them all up. I'll defend in depth, as opposed to having some foreknowledge of what does bad look like, and can I perhaps take it out at a place well outside my perimeter. Now, having said that, I can see some eyebrows go up, but we can't actually hack back as the private sector. That's true. But we need to have some cognizance of what's out there to a greater degree than we might be allowed if we simply patrolled our own internal networks. I'll say more about that in a second. The economics favor the adversary, meaning they get to choose the time, the place. They don't play by the rules. Adversary owns audacity and maneuver. Initiative is theirs. The private sector and the government fight alone. They fight in their silos. You defend A, I will defend B, and we'll just meet at the seam. Turns out that's what's called a division of effort. That's actually an agreement to not collaborate. It's hugely, hugely injurious. And then finally, we share at human speed. Most of the ISACs, the information sharing and analysis centers, which are set up with the 16 critical infrastructures, most of them today share at human speed at best. And occasionally an email comes across, or there's a quarterly meeting where they get together and say, hey, what are our best practices? How do we actually compare and contrast those things? The financial sector has stepped way out. They have this thing called the FSARC, the Analysis Research Center, where they're trying to share at machine speed, but it's only the big few, right, who can afford to participate in that, financially afford to participate that are doing it. And therefore, we're still perhaps not in the right place on that. The future, we need to defend the core and the data. And we need to do that continuously. We need to actually understand that these systems are not secure. They are at best defensible, right? And therefore we need to have a constant understanding of how they're being employed and used. And if data is the embodiment of your wealth and treasure, defend that as much or more as the artifacts that contain that data. Continuous situational awareness is required. We must attack the adversary economics. If an adversary can hold us at risk for pennies on the dollar, we need to turn that around and make it such that it's going to cost them dollars to hold pennies at risk. I'll explain in a minute. The defense perhaps needs to steal audacity back from the adversary, give a dynamic face, make it such that the adversary is trying to guess what you're up to, what you're doing, where your stuff is. Perhaps put them on the kind of back foot in terms of trying to understand how have you actually arrayed your defenses. That has a rich and storied history in the physical world. We need to bring that into the virtual world. We need to have a collaborative application of diverse authority. I'm often asked the question, especially in testimony, like, who's in charge of cyberspace, right? So you got to put your hands on your hips, say it just that way, and sit about 6 feet tall with big lights shining behind you. Who's in charge in cyberspace? Which essentially says, who is the one neck that I'm going to grab in order to say, you let this happen? That's actually a decent question in the time of a crisis, like who's going to step into the room and allocate the task and say, this is what we're going to do, right? You know, this is how we're going to synchronize the results. But in the day-to-day royal, the day-to-day steady state of cyberspace, it's a really dumb question. Right? Maybe there are no stupid questions, but there are dumb questions. That's a dumb question. Think about the physical world, right? Now, I parked just across the street, or that way, just across the street. I locked my car, not because I don't trust Purdue, but because I know that I have a meaningful role to play in my own security, and that if my car was kind of ransacked, somebody reached in, stole the radio, Avis would say, that's your fault because you didn't lock the car. You left the keys on the dashboard? Why? Because I'd never forget where they are. that's just stupid if you're an individual. So I participated in that security. There are police on campus that make sure that people from the University of Michigan or others kind of are repelled at first sight. They kind of navigate to make sure that order and discipline kind of is on the streets. I'll bet Indiana has a National Guard in case Ohio attacks you, so that you can kind of push back. Or in a time of crisis, you can help, right, respond to a disaster. TSA is going to meet me at the airport this afternoon to make sure I, as a prospective terrorist, am not a prospective terrorist. Meanwhile, out in Colorado, the North American Air Defense Command is scanning for missiles coming out of North Korea. And if one comes out of there, they'll shoot it down. Meanwhile, somebody's guarding the harbors, the ports. There's an army that's essentially kind of operating abroad to defend forward. You know how all that works. What's really interesting about that is that they all do their work concurrently with some degree of natural, right, synergy, but they don't consult with one another before they shoot the three-stage missile down or before they kind of prevent a terrorist from getting on board. The individuals, the organizations, the private sector, the public sector has all figured out how to do this collaboration kind of line abreast, side by side by side. We don't have anything approaching that for cyberspace at the moment, and yet we must. And then finally, sharing at Mistine speed, that's the only way to stay up with this. We have to figure out how do we routinize, automate, right, kind of use heuristics, bordering on analytics, bordering on artificial intelligence, which is still oversold, but I think it's getting closer. How do we use that to essentially aid and abet our efforts in this space? So a way forward, not surprisingly, strategy should be our guide, right? We shouldn't just kind of respond, right, ad hoc or perhaps heuristically. We should say, what is it we're trying to do? And we should therefore say we're going to array our resources to do that in a prioritized manner. We're not going to be to defend all things against all perils. Foundational capabilities, not surprisingly, will be across technology, people, and procedure. Roles and responsibilities will be really, really important in this. So what remains, right? So here's my pithy kind of 50,000-foot level of here's a national strategy. Now I'm going to kind of offer this up to the panels, commissions that I'm on, may or may not be accepted, but I think holistically it looks something like this. Basic security theory still matters. I'll show a chart as to what I mean by that. Relentless pursuit of innovation, automation, routinization. There's a lot of that in this room, and we need to take full advantage of it. We need to essentially out-innovate, kind of collaborate, right, our adversaries in this space. Policy and doctrine, we need to get the roles and responsibilities right, and it needs to respect the true nature of cyberspace as opposed to just dragging those things that might have used in other domains along with us. Concurrency and collaboration are required. Division of effort is a siren on the rocks. Right, and a simply react, right, kind of detect and react strategy, that's a disaster. Right? Audacity works both ways. We need to take on the adversaries in this space. And then professionalism matters, education and career tracks. It is noteworthy that we're kind of having this discussion on the Purdue campus. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I will talk about that and the basic security theory and not bore you with all the rest. So what's the basic security look like? So for those of you who kind of had any kind of schooling or professional grounding in the nuclear strategy of how do you deter adversaries in a world where nuclear weapons are the existential threat, this might be familiar. And so I'm going to lift and shift that a little bit. And having said that, it doesn't work completely because if you're in the nuclear world, right, when the offense shows up, it's game over. It's offense dominant. When you're in the cyber world, it's offense persistent. The offense is always on the field. The adversary is always on the field, whether that's kind of a dumb human being who's not using the system properly, whether it's a squirrel that's chewing your Ethernet cable, or whether it's a Russian who's actually trying to do some real harm. So here's the strategy. I'm going to start from the bottom, and there's a distinction between the green and the red. At the bottom, you have to actually say kind of what's your strategy? What's important to you? What matters to you? You have to actually do some thinking. Ask most companies about what's the most important data you have on the system. They break eye contact, they look away. Right? So I don't know what's on the system. Stuff is on the system. I'm going to defend it all. That's insane. Right? Need to know what it is that's on the system. What are you defending? And with what degree of investment are you willing to do that? You then need to declare those priorities so that the people that are actually defending the system, or the people holding that at risk, understand those priorities, and they therefore are properly advised as to what investments they should make, or perhaps what consequences will ensue if they take that on. We very seldom do those first two layers, but without those two foundational layers, the rest you're just kind of running around practicing Brownian motion. We need to actually do traditional information assurance. That's the third level. Inherent robustness and resilience. Make the network, which is comprised of technology and people and procedure, invest in the people as well. Make that such that it's naturally resilient and robust. It's never going to be secure. That's a different goal, and that's perhaps, that's a knee in the curve that if you go another 5% beyond that, you'll expend 90% of your money. But material, doctrine, and people should be kind of an investment area. Then, having created a defensible architecture, the topmost green layer, you need to actually understand how it's being employed, really employed. Right? That's about cognizance, vigilance. That's about understanding what the life forces are on your system. I'm amazed at how many companies, or for that matter, public sector organizations, they do the first three with some reasonable facility, and then they assume that the network will defend itself. They therefore don't actually apply the human component of how do I understand what the state of the network is. It's eternal deficiencies playing out. Therefore, they don't do that topmost green level, and they're shocked, stunned, and amazed when they come back in on Monday, having left on Friday, and the network didn't defend itself. It won't. Now I'm going to get into the red space. So the active defense, the local close-in fight. If an adversary says your resilience isn't enough, your deterrence by denial isn't enough, you're kind of denying me my opportunity to essentially have my way with you. If they still come at you, you need to be prepared to essentially repel borders. You need to be prepared to essentially engage in that close-in fight. That gets a little dangerous in terms of authorities because by law within the United States and like-minded nations, organizations aren't allowed to operate outside, right, those kind of jurisdictions that they physically own or have lease rights to operate. And therefore, there needs to be some application of inherently governmental authority or adjacent authority, but you can't do this by yourself. You actually have to be in a collaboration. Ultimately, I think, not just between private and private, but between private and public, private and government, to essentially bring those tools to bear. And then finally, right, if you got an adversary that's still coming at you, they said, look, your inherent resilience isn't enough, you're kind of pushing me off at the perimeter or just outside the perimeter isn't enough, I'm still coming at you. You need to be able to go and impose consequences on them. Now, this isn't necessarily just in cyberspace. It could be that the consequence you impose is a financial sanction. It could be that you just shame them. Now, a lot of the countries doing this are not shameable, but give it a whirl. It might be that you essentially criminally indict them. It might be that you kind of arrest and extradite them. You need to bring that power to bear as well. Here's though kind of something I think is really important about this. This is hierarchical. If you're engaging in the red stuff before you've done the green stuff, shame on you. Right? A, it won't succeed, and B, you're reckless. Right? You're swinging a baseball bat in a small, dark room with lots of china in it. And therefore, you need to do the foundational stuff, work your way from the bottom to the top. Two, independent and hierarchical layers, but you need to work it from the bottom up. Two, this is a whole of society approach. This is not a pitch to the government what it should do or a pitch to some private individual what it should do. Rather, it begins to describe what might be the kind of engagement of all of these instruments of power in a collaborative side-by-side manner. And frankly, these things all have to be done concurrently, again, though, with some sense of what the hierarchy is. Now, the basic security theory that's in the background now, still mattering, there is an expectation that not just this grand strategy plays out, but that everybody does their bit. Right? I locked my car, right? I didn't put my iPad on the dash, I didn't leave my keys on the dash, I did some basic kind of local work so that I could participate in the physical defense of this realm. There's something called the National Institute of Standards Technology Framework. It asks some pretty simple questions of, have you identified, upper right quadrant, have you identified the assets that are valuable to you? Have you taken measures to protect them, information assurance? Have you got the ability to detect anomalies on your system? Do you have the ability to respond? And do you have the ability to recover? Can you actually work your way through when the system's not operating in perfect sense? And that virtuous cycle, but that continuous cycle, really concurrent phases, there's an expectation that individuals, private organizations, government will do those sorts of things as their contribution to the fray. Right? And so kind of take that kind of grand strategy on the first slide, add it with this expectation of local diligence, and you get something that says this just might make for a defensible, right, kind of space, defensible realm. The other things that I said was that collaboration and concurrency are required. I think that concurrency, that collaboration needs to be between the private sector, the government sector, the lower two circles, and it needs to be done in an international context. I'm on the board of directors of the FedEx Corporation. We operate in 220 countries. We have 450,000 employees. I'm not sure what the exact number is, but probably maybe a third or maybe a half of those at most are U.S. citizens, right? And that geography that we operate across requires us to operate in a coalition attendant to the values of our kind of parent country, but consistent with the expectations and values of all those countries. I'll be familiar with this by the time I'm done. There we go. Now, I've called out a particular role for the government, and because I think the government is underrepresented in terms of making a full and fair contribution to this mix. And I'm not going to describe the government's first role as being one of a regulatory nature or perhaps imposing cost. The government sometimes walks into a bank that's just been robbed and slaps the teller, right? That's not appropriate, right? What the government needs to do is to figure out what are its beneficial components and lead with those. And I've got those here in this order. First, the government has a bully pulpit, right? It can serve as a promoter. It can serve as someone who shapes opinion or something shaping opinion, lead by example, kind of practice it at home such that it then might be kind of something others do. It can facilitate. It can facilitate either by using that bully pulpit, or it can facilitate by perhaps creating incentives or liabilities, or by creating venues or permissions for the private sector where most of the innovative capacity lives, at least 90-95%, and most of the kind of build, operate, and sustain lives. But the government can help in that regard. Right? There's still a concern, not just within sectors, say the financial sector or the electrical sector, but especially a concern across sectors that we're not allowed to share. That if we were to share some sense as to what cyber threat we faced, that a tort lawyer would come flying out of a closet and sue me, or perhaps my shareholders would sue me. And therefore, we're somewhat discreet about sharing the true kind of fine-grained knowledge about what transpired, and therefore we let somebody else suffer this before we do. The government can be a contributor, right? So there's something at the Department of Homeland Security just stood up called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and it now is trying to lean forward in the straps and say, how do I actually take government-acquired information, maybe it's from the National Security Agency, kind of operating as it should, right, abroad, trying to figure out what the threats are kind of broadly, or maybe taking the National Security Agency's best practices, because its fundamental role is to discover vulnerabilities, take those best practices and convey them to the private sector, contribute to the advance of knowledge in the private sector. It's not going to be the bulwark, but it's going to make an important contribution. It can be a co-conspirator in threat identification and mitigation. Now, I use that kind of with tongue in cheek. It can be a collaborator in that. Now, the UK, the United Kingdom, I think has this exactly right. In the United States, we have this huge issue of if a private organization discovers something, it's probably proprietary because it's attached to their kind of digital infrastructure. Or if the government discovers something that's shareable or should be shared, it's probably classified because by the time it crossed that threshold, there are kind of unique sources and methods in that, and it probably tracks back to the intelligence community or something else. And at this moment, what you have is this challenge of how do I get this information, it's either proprietary or classified, how do I have it cross over such that it can benefit all God's creatures, right? And then the sanitization process takes place, which any of you who are familiar with that can go months to years, by which time the technology that it's attributable to is in the Smithsonian. And so you wonder, why did you spend the last year kind of taking this thing across the finish line? The Brits have essentially reversed that process. What they've done is to say, maybe we should collaborate at the lowest possible level, not at the highest possible level. Not at the strategic level, but rather down here where the nuts and bolts take place. So what they've done is they've taken 650 of their version of NSA. That's a lot of people for them. That's probably 10-12% of their entire kind of NSA equivalent workforce. They've taken them and they've put them in a place where natural light streams in, right? So they operate in an unclassified environment alongside about 150 members of the private sector. And what they do all day, every day is they discover vulnerabilities. And then begin to mitigate those vulnerabilities across kind of private and public networks, such that if they have a common understanding, it's not already proprietary or classified, it can then off that floor that they're operating on inform the work of hundreds of thousands of people who kind of sit back in those stovepipes. And the collaboration, having been affected at the lowest possible level, stays strong, right, intertwined as you move up the pipe. It actually works. They've been in business now for 2 years, right? They put out a report a year ago, which I kind of read stem to stern. I think they've just put out their second report, but the first one had a meaningful and significant decrease, right, in at least the quantity, if not the effect, the impact of threats that exist broadly across these public and private networks. Right, so that's hugely effective. And then finally, down at the bottom, this is essentially a reverse of the chart I showed you before, which had from green to red, top to bottom. Down at the bottom, I've got active defense, meaning that if there's an adversary that still comes at you, if Russia attempts to influence our elections in 2018 over our shoulder, or in 2020, if they're still doing that, then we can't just stand on shore and catch the arrows, run around saying we'll just try to actually kind of endeavor to persevere. We're going to do the Monty Python routine of saying it's just a scratch. You can't really hurt me. So I still have, kind of my kind of corporal body. We have to actually go forward. We have to go forward and essentially knock the stilts out from underneath that and declare that if you kind of are arraying an offense against me, that an appropriate response to that, a defensive response to that, is to defend forward. And that's, in fact, going on as we speak. Kind of at the practical level, if you're a technologist in the room, which everybody's making eye contact now, there's a set of things you would do to essentially affect basic information assurance. Defensible systems actually defend the system and prepare for disaster so that you can power through it. I have grayed out most of that since I don't want to kind of be preaching to the choir, especially when perhaps I'm a sinner of sorts. I might not understand this to the degree and kind of with the granularity that you do. I would just say that this is really, really important as a foundation. But I would say the following, which is that if your goal is to make a secure system, that's simply not possible. So on this chart, which I think I put up for leaders or policymakers of, hey, if you essentially are accountable for the operation of any particular sort, whether that's broadly or just locally, you need to think about three things. Think about cyber in its real form, which is its people, process, and technology. If you're only defending one of those, you're not defending any of those. Two, here's this point I want to hammer down. Security is not possible. Defense at net speed is the goal. Now, I have 3 children. I love them all equally. One of them is a submarine officer. He flies really low and slow. And he graduated from the Naval Academy. I still don't quite get all of that. Economically, that was a really good thing. And teaching at the Naval Academy, I like to say, takes an Air Force officer to raise a naval officer. It turns out it's literally true. But I will say this about what he's taught me about this theory. So I asked him once, I said, so, Paul, what's a submarine all about? I need to get my head around that. I'm your father, and, I like to think that I'm a kind of citizen of the world, understand these things, these complicated things. He says, only 2 things you need to know about the sub, Dad. One, it's trying to kill the crew, right? 24 hours a day, the sub's job is first and foremost to kill the crew, right? Because there's a nuclear reactor on board. It's got a 40-year power supply. Any submariners in the room? It's got a nuclear reactor on board. It's it's complicated, it's dangerous if not properly managed. Knock on wood, never had a real problem on board one of the submarines. He says there are lots of curved dark spaces, whirring machines in there. Get below 100 feet underwater. I don't know how far they can really go, but get below 100 feet underwater, pinhole leak, take your arm off at 5 yards. It is dangerous. I said, well, I won't share that with your mother. What's the second thing? He goes, the second thing is it's our home. He said, we strap this thing on. It makes our air. It makes our water. It's got a 40-year power supply. And we sally forth having strapped this thing on, and they go out for 3, 4, 5 months at a time. And we outmaneuver, more audacious than our adversary in that commonly dangerous space. That's cyberspace in a nutshell. Right? It is eternally deficient. It will kill you if you're not paying attention to it. Right? If you kind of just store your stuff in the cloud and you just leave it at that, it's like, it's in the cloud, I have no idea where it is. I'm a cyber idiot. And you then kind of say, but it wasn't properly attended to by whoever actually sold you the cloud service, not mentioning anyone by name. But if it's not properly attended to because you didn't take the time and attention to understand it down to its deck plates and say, I understand what its deficiencies are, but I'm going to strap this thing on and I'm going to use it and I'm going to practice operational ability, maneuverability, possibly audacity, to outmaneuver adversaries in this space, even if those adversaries are my kind of employees who perhaps aren't practicing the right kind of cyber hygiene. If you think about it that way, which is never secure, only defensible, therefore I must defend it, you're in the right place intellectually. And you just will, outwit your adversaries in that space. And finally, it's about operations more than technology. I was affiliated with a company not long ago that actually had some issues attendant to the kind of the WannaCry virus. And when we looked at what had happened, it turns out a very small percentage of the servers have been affected by WannaCry, right? That was the North Korean kind of event in the spring of 2017. And when you looked at the physical map of this organization, they were perfectly physically distributed. You couldn't have done this more finely if you'd essentially asked Rand McNally to give you the map. And so we said, why these very few, and why are they so perfectly distributed? Well, because they're the hub controllers, was the answer from the technologist. Well, why didn't you patch the hub controllers? Well, because the ops people said we can't patch the hub controllers until we're sure that the patch works on all the other kind of things. Well, why is that? Well, the hub controllers are the most important part of the system. And to which I responded, so you didn't defend the hub controllers because they're the most important part of the system. Well, that's not what we said. No, that's what you said. I'm not sure that's what you meant, right? And why was that? Because the operators said, we're thinking about this as operations. Do not impact our operation with a patch that might not be well formed. And therefore, to the technologist said, you need our permission to patch. So now you don't fix that by beating the living daylights out of the IT crowd, the technologists, because they're not the ones who took the risk. They're the ones that are trying to discover the risk that their own friends are taking. What you do to fix that is to say, this is an operational issue. Patching is an operational issue. We're going to hold the operators accountable for patching from this day forward, and therefore the operators, if they have failed to patch and something untoward happens, are the accountable party. All of a sudden now, at that particular company, you need the permission of the operators to not patch. And the IT crowd, the technologists, are the operators' best friends. Right? First meeting, kind of over beers, was what is patching, and why should I do that? That then has a kind of salutary effect on roles and responsibilities. That's really important. I'm going to wrap up here with just a kind of a look into education, and then a look over the shoulder at that original problem I showed you about what the Russians are up to. Education and career tracks, of course they matter. Right? I think that's why we're in the room, right? There's largely an ability here to kind of exchange information, to share best practices, share insights, conflict of ideas here. It's going to make us all the smarter for it. And so it's a marriage of what's strategy and doctrine, what's operational practice, technology and education, or an execution. But this requires education to match. Now this is a particular look into how the U.S. Naval Academy, thanks to SPAF and a few others, thinks about this. We actually have a cyber program at the U.S. Naval Academy. As I've indicated earlier, it's about cyber operations, not cyber operations, but operation in a world dependent upon cyber. And therefore we think that there are 3 levels of this. We think that everybody, no matter what you're going to do in life, who goes through the United States Naval Academy, needs to know something more about cyber than they naturally do. Right? Because what we get at the age of 17, 18 are not digital natives, we get app natives. Right? They can't really tell you where the cloud is. They think it's a thing or a place, but they really don't care about that. I just want to know that this app gets me to the right place at the right time. And therefore they think at the surface level about things that have a strategic consequence if you don't understand something about the underpinnings. So everybody needs to get some basic familiarity with this, maybe akin to a driver's education. There are many, the Aspen Institute estimates that 71 million people within the United States in various professions that don't have cyber in their title need to know something more in order to be professionally adept at what they do. Lawyers need to know something about cyber law. Engineers need to know something about creating resilient systems, fault-tolerant systems, which has a cyber underpinning. Scientists need to know something about their dependence on digital infrastructure such that they take reasonable precautions to ensure that they're resilient and robust against natural or perhaps predatory practices. And then finally, at the top of this pyramid, there are a few who do have cyber in their name. As most of you know, we're still short in terms of the kind of number of people who have that deep and sharp expertise. I think by one estimate, by the year 2020, we'll be about 2 million short in the United States. It's a great time to have cyber in your professional title. But they're the tip of the iceberg, the one that's most visible. We need to worry about the bottom 2 layers as well. At the U.S. Naval Academy, then, we think about that all, many, few, right, kind of prospect this way. These circles, we think that all of those contributions, all of those disciplines need to be somehow allocated across the all, many, few. Right? So some sense of operational theory at the Naval Academy, we call that offense, defense. We're the military after all. Human factors, policy, law, ethics. There are certain means and methods that are appropriate, certain means and methods that are not appropriate. The defense of privacy is as important as the pursuit of security in American society, like-minded nations. Security, kind of basics of what does it mean to be secure, and increasingly that means to be defensible and then well defended. We need to think about the implications of connectivity, networking, data structures, computing, programming, physical systems, all the basic blocking and tackling in terms of the underpinning technology. If you have a program that's trying to serve the interests, the disciplines that cut across, right, the all, the many, the few, that doesn't have one of these components, it's probably short-sighted in terms of not then equipping everybody in the room who's going to participate ultimately in this defense. Let me wrap up. Remember this chart that I showed you earlier where I said the Russians came at us at 3 different levels? I see some of you taking pictures of the charts. They're not that interesting, but if you want a copy, see me after and I'll just send you a soft copy of it. I promise with no tag-alongs, right? So I promise. So this 3 levels that I showed you earlier, I talked about the foundational level. What's the response to that? Just basic information assurance, basic due diligence, basic defensive network components, which is technology, people, and process. The second level, I said, what's the response to that? That's a collaborative endeavor between the various parties that participate in an election system or perhaps in the creation and defense of an electrical grid. This third level, that's a problem. Because what happens is if you do all the stuff that I've described, I may or may not have the right answer, but if you do all the stuff that I described, you're probably going to have some pretty significant impact on that foundational level, the basic blocking and tackling level. Probably going to have a pretty healthy impact in terms of setting up the collaboration, the due diligence, right, the kind of coherence across all of these instruments of power at that second level. But this third level, if somebody's going to try to subvert you using this digital infrastructure, right, it actually has some pernicious effects, pernicious abilities, they're going to come at you on the third level, then the things we've been talking about for the last 10, 15 years, and frankly there's not much new in this presentation in that regard, things we've been talking about will wind up falling short. Because if you're going to defend your confidence, you're going to defend your psychology, you're going to defend your kind of sense that, hey, I'm okay and I've got forward motion, you need to have strategy that essentially is something that the adversary needs to catch up to and chase. You need to have critical thinking such that you can properly diagnose what's being done to you, that you're not kind of incredulous. And you need to have national will and execution. And if I worry about anything in cyberspace, I worry most about that. That we're not joined up in that regard. We don't have a national strategy. We don't have forward momentum. Kind of if the Russians were to come again at us in 2016, they would say, yeah, the fault isn't in the stars, it was in you, right? We took advantage of your internal divisions. We took advantage of your not being joined up. We took advantage of you not perhaps collaborating across these stovepipes. You were easy prey. It's a great article written in Politico.com. It's about 2 years old now by a guy named Reed Standish. And what he says in the article was, he asks a question. He says, why are the Finns, the nation of Finland, why are they not worried about the Russians careening into their election the way they did into ours, right? And the answer isn't because the Russians aren't trying, right? They're actually kind of equal service in this regard. He said the answer is attributable to three things. One, the Finnish government places a premium on critical thinking, right? So in the education system, when they're raising their children, you can't just kind of memorize and recite back, right, the Gettysburg Address. You can't just memorize and recite back some kind of mathematical principle. So now you actually need to internalize that, figure out what it means, kind of look at the convenient, inconvenient facts, and give me a recitation as to how you synthesize and essentially make sense of those facts. Critical thinking is given a premium. Two, the government itself, which is only a stride 5.6 million people. You could get them all here on the Purdue campus and tell them what to do and then disperse them. But two, the Finnish government goes to great lengths to have a forward-looking strategy and then to communicate that to all the stakeholders and to essentially create this forward momentum. And three, they have material experience with the Russians, living cheek by jowl with them. So if you're Russian, you need to do three things. First, you need to catch up to the Finns. They're not waiting to be picked apart. Two, you need to get past the critical thinkers. And three, you need to look like something other than a Russian. Right? We need to put those advantages on our side. We need to essentially be more cognizant, more aware of what's happening in the space. We need to actually go back to having a premium placed on critical thinking. And three, we need forward momentum. Otherwise, we're just standing still, ready to be picked apart. And the approximation of collaboration as division of effort, where you defend A, I'll defend B, ne'er the twain shall meet, will kill us. It'll be a disaster. I've left all of 6 minutes for any questions you might ask, and I'd be happy to take any of the questions that you have. So who's got one? Yes, sir.
Sir, great information. So as I'm listening to this and using your example as the sub, one day a state-sponsored actor torpedoed that sub, and then the next day had a ship in the harbor, New York Harbor, and then sent missiles into New York City, killed 100 people. These are kinetic actions. We would have kinetic responses.
Right.
If the same thing happened in the cyber world, where they hacked into the navigation system that resulted in the same end state, hacked into the subway system that resulted in the same amount of civilian casualties as those missiles, at what point do kinetic responses move over into the cyber world? And even in your green to red, at the top, I saw no kinetic actions there. So I guess by policy, I know kinetically it's a lot clearer who the aggressor is, the violator is, right off the spot. Usually with cyber, sometimes it takes a little while in analysis. But at what point do those actions warrant kinetic response?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I didn't mean for this chart to be interpreted as a cyber chart. It is. I apply it to the cyber world, but I didn't mean for the kind of tools that we'd use at any level to be restricted to cyber. So let's say that somebody does just what you've said, which is, hey, they're going to attack Wall Street using some zero-day vulnerability that they've inserted into the supply chain. Leave the mechanism aside. And we kind of get to the place where we say, hey, look, all of these green things, they didn't save us, right? We're therefore having to kind of defend ourselves close in or perhaps impose some consequence on them. We need to use all instruments of power at our disposal to do this, right? Now, I kind of went through kind of an alliteration of financial sanctions, kind of public shaming, all that stuff. The kinetic power that we can bring to bear with the military is included in that. But in our society, many societies, there's this idea of necessity and proportionality. So therefore, we need to make sure that the punishment fits the crime, right? That we've actually got a long view on this, and we're not simply reacting with a nuclear weapon, right, to something that is a kind of a cyber event. There probably are situations where a nuclear weapon might be the right choice. God forbid that we live through that day, right? But I'm with you on that. I would say that I thought the question you were going to ask is, you know, why when we have those very clean lines, those tripwires established in the physical space, why aren't they that clean, and why isn't the government coming in to help, right, in cyberspace? Government's been through a maturing process from 2012 to present. Remember when the Iranians did what they did in 2012, the government did not stand in. It was out of respect for the sovereignty of the private sector. Turns out in hindsight, not too smart. When the North Koreans attacked Sony Pictures, the government said, I will defend the private sector against nation-state adversaries, but I don't know how, right? So at a time and place of my choosing was the language. In 2016, the government was not aware of what was happening at the second and especially the third level, therefore didn't have the cognizance to stand in. So 2018, the government did two things. Not as the only player in this space and not even as the primary player in this space, but you've asked the question. Government first said, I have to be cognizant. So I have to actually go forward, and if there are likely adversaries, I have to understand what the devil they're up to. Right? I can't just stand back and wait to react well. And two, when it saw things that were kind of on the rise, essentially holding our election at risk, kicked out the legs from underneath that. Now, most of that, I'm sure, is classified, and so I won't describe it further, but I think the remarkable thing about the day after the 2018 election is when the losers got up, they said, we lost fair and square. Unless, of course, you were in Georgia, but that's a local issue. Right, so. Yes, sir.
Wonderful presentation. Is this on? Can you hear me?
I'll turn the question into what I want.
A lot of vision, a lot of wonderful goals. There's a huge gap between reality now and much of what you have in the presentation. So what is the next step? So the government spending, while they are talking about improving funding, a lot of that money hasn't shown up yet. We know that a lot of times people don't go to action until after the fact, and we're looking for a global meltdown before we see a significant action. So what do you think is the most logical next step to expect for 2020, say in federal funding, private sector funding, and the partnerships between the two?
It's a great question, and if we had 8 hours, I'd give you a lot more detail, but you'd be bored to tears. But that's why the title of my slide is this, time to get on with it. Everything that I suggest in here is doable, actionable, right? And I've tried to put that out in a coherent way. So let me just take the last example kind of, in hand. The United States government in 2012 just stood off, right? 2018, it stood in, and I think to good and material effect. That's one small but important contribution, right? The private sector increasingly says, I get it. I'm a part of this. I can't just wait for somebody to save my networks or defend my networks. If I'm not doing basic resilience, then I'm going to be held accountable by the SEC. If I'm a public corporation, my shareholders, even if I'm not, the private shareholders if I'm not, and by adversaries who are just going to kind of have their way with me. So all of these pieces are beginning to come into play. And I think the thing that's missing is the kind of inherent cohesion, the coherence of them, so that everybody can say, I got it. If I place myself at this part of the line, I have confidence to the right of me and to the left of me, the other parts are also being applied. And I frankly think, while this is a bit of a big hand over a little map, it's a question of just do it. Right? We don't lack the technology that we can kind of deploy to kind of defend ourselves. We don't lack the authorities to defend ourselves. What we lack is the strategy and the coherence of all those pieces. And if we did that, we'd find that life is as noisy and much of a royal as it is a walk across, say, eastern New York City, but manageable, defensible, right? You can essentially caution, you can take your risk appropriately, and you can, just like my son's submarine, sally forth. Yes, sir.
Hi, great presentation. And you talked about the importance of strategy and priorities with respect to cyber defense. So the introduction of Internet of Things, the IoT,
oh, yes,
has increased the attack surface. by introducing more vulnerable devices, starting from critical infrastructure to supply chain to everything, right? Can you share your thoughts on what the strategy and priorities when it comes to IoT?
Yeah, I think three things about the Internet of Things, and one of them isn't just say no. So they're here, they're coming on, right? They're kind of overwhelming us. The first is that we need to understand what they are and what they're not, right? So they are attack surfaces, but they're kind of limited feature attack surfaces, right? It's much easier to determine an anomaly, right, in an Internet of thing than it is in a general purpose computer that accepts any piece of code as perhaps the next thing that it's supposed to do. And so therefore, if we understand that these things are not themselves inherently trustworthy, but they do have some perhaps smaller envelope around which you can define anomalies, we need to make sure that we take pains to do that and build networks that we say are inherently composed of, you know, untrustworthy things, but I actually have an overlay that says I understand what their state of play is at a moment in time. And third, I think that we do need to enforce a regime where we try to figure out, you know, at what point they constitute too great a risk to us. So there's no Patch Tuesday for the Internet of Things, but there just might be some kind of, you know, limit beyond which we say, hey, these things, if they're in your network, I'm no longer going to insure you. I'm no longer going to perhaps kind of hold you kind of innocent if something bad happens to you. We need to impose some consequence for how you use these things. The federal government is beginning down this road. Congressman Will Hurd has introduced legislation where he has said that the government will essentially practice those three things itself and then have an expectation that vendors that deal with the government will similarly do those three things. I do think that it's possibly too little too late, but at least it's a drop in the bucket heading in the right direction. Yes, sir.
In regards to private sector security, going back to
question.
your green to red chart, when you get to the top level where they beat the access they're in, there's, you know, intruders doing material harm to your network. And on the physical side of security, there are armed guards in buildings. There are, you know, someone's robbing a bank, the guard can shoot them, drop them dead. Not something so serious in the cyber world, but is there a point in time where the legalities of a private sector defend forward policy going forward
Hackback?
Pardon?
Hackback?
Yes, a hackback.
Excellent.
To stop them from damaging your system.
Yep.
You know, the IT security gets on it, goes in there, and, you know, wrecks their ability to do damage to your further damage to your system.
Yeah, so right now the law is relatively clear and therefore unhelpful. So the law would say that if somebody's actually beating you at your perimeter or just inside, maybe just outside, they've just stolen your stuff. There it is. You can see it right there, right? Outside your system, it is illegal for you to operate outside your system. You don't have the authority to stand on somebody else's territory without their permission. Therefore, you can only not hack back, but you can actually do what might be called hot pursuit. My sense is that we need to give companies an ability to do reasonable things with the analog being the physical world, right, to essentially engage an adversary in hot pursuit. But we need to have strict limitations and accountability imposed upon them about how far they go. You can see your stuff right there, right, you know, and you can actually lean in and essentially encrypt it or recover it with no damage, no collateral effects to something else. I think that's reasonable. It's not now the law. I think the idea of hackback is very dangerous. Remember that example I gave about the Iranians doing something in financial infrastructure, the U.S. government thinking it was thoughtful, but in fact it was feckless, didn't do a darn thing. Some companies who were just taking this beating day after day actually read this thing called Sarbanes-Oxley, where the CEO signs to say, I am accountable for the fiduciary integrity of this organization. And if I'm getting beat to death in cyberspace, I just can't stand here and take it. And the government's told me they're not going to do anything. So they, in some cases, hacked back. I'm not of the opinion that I know who that was, but I know that in one case, when they did it, they went to the wrong place because they literally looked at a map like that and they said, it's Germany. Germany's doing this to us. And what they did was to engage the innocents, right, who already have been victimized in one of those red spaces and caused a further conflagration with respect to two nation states. And the one that got all the way back to Tehran, they realized they got into the middle of a firefight that the Iranians didn't start. The Iranians were actually responding to what they thought was a provocation. And so when they got back to Tehran, Tehran says, got it, finally, a worthy adversary, and started to bring their full might to bear on this organization. And that organization, a private sector organization, did not have the ability to arrest and extradite, did not have the ability to financially sanction, did not have the ability to call a UN general session. They were essentially witless, alone, and afraid, very much afraid in that space. That's an inherently governmental proposition, and we don't want to actually have the private sector stand in on that. So I think there's something in between where we are and where we're going to go. I know I've gone about 7 minutes into your break. I apologize for that. I kind of thank you for your hospitality. I see that one of us didn't get the word on the dress code. I will do that appropriately as I leave, but all the best for a great conference. Thanks. Thanks very much. Thanks.